Hey Scott, this is Ira, and I'm recording here some audio feedback on your statement of belief that I hope will be helpful for you as you complete your final revisions of the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay. My aim here is to help you think about how you move from your initial thinking here in the statement of belief to that more theoretical, fully worked through systematic argument that defines good argument and thinks about it in that rigorously systematic way. So my aim here is not to sort of share feedback that's evaluative of your statement of belief, which is a perfectly good version of what it is, but rather to offer some thoughts and suggestions that I hope will be helpful in your final moments of revision of this the major essay for the course, Defining Good Arguments in Digital Contexts. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to read back through and highlight a few moments, things where I think you're saying something clearly or particularly well. I want to reflect back, and then also some moments where I want to challenge you or push you to think more systematically. Basically, you start off by noting that, argument is inevitable, and you frame this essay in terms of our class, which is perfectly fine for that, but of course not how you'll want to frame the major essay, the theoretical argument. And then you break down argument success, good argument, into where it takes place, presentation, respectfulness, and evidence. So right off the bat, you tell us what we're going to get. The sort of domains where we'll think about argumentative success are going to be location, presentation, respectfulness, and evidence that would prove a point. And one of the things I'm going to want to sort of see more in the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay is what's the relationship between these things and why exactly. So then here you talk about a number of different places where argument happens, and I think you talk about that in a really interesting and useful way. You're thinking pretty carefully about the differences between interpersonal communication physically, where you can see somebody's emotions, somebody's posture, somebody's eye contact, all of that influences you interpersonally. And I think that's a really good point. And in fact, we in rhetoric, we call all of that stuff ethos. So in other words, it's the character or credibility of the speaker. And so here you're distinguishing between the way the ethos works in interpersonal communication and the way it works in other contexts. One of the things, you talk about it over the phone, and finally you talk about it on the internet, and you talk about the difficulty of building ethos on the internet, and I think that's a really good point. Obviously, in the major essay, the Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts essay, you're talking almost exclusively about digital contexts, and so I'll be looking to see a lot more, of course, about those contexts. But I think in terms of your own initial thinking through of this, that's really helpful to be sort of comparing the way ethos works in those different spaces, those different kinds of context. And I think your point that username is one of the things that immediately stands out and conditions how audiences respond to you online. I think that's a really interesting, important point. I have, like you, I have also somewhat discredited people in my own mind because of their awful usernames. And I think your point that what's at stake there has to do with who you feel like you're talking to is really important. So one thing I'd be really interested to hear you talk more about in that major essay, the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay, is how that works in more ways. So you've got one way the ethos works in digital contexts, and that's really important. And I'm looking forward to seeing you think that through in some more ways in that larger theoretical piece. And like I said, another thing I kind of want to encourage you to do is make sure that you're connecting the different pieces of good argument, and then also explaining why they're good argument. What at the end of the day is argument for, or what is argument for in digital contexts. So then, if that makes sense, really what I'm saying there is, in order to talk about what good argument is, you have to also offer some sense of why we argue, what it's for. In much the same way, we only know what a good pot is for, like a good clay pot is for, if we know what the clay pot. We only know what a good clay pot is if we know what the clay pot is for, right? So you could have a clay pot that is basically decorative, and it could be a good clay pot, even though it's unglazed and can't hold water, because it's decorative. And at that point, what you're looking at isn't really just a clay pot, but rather a piece of art or a piece of an objet d'art, and a piece of like kind of ambient furnishings that helps establish a mood in a human, domestic space of some sort. Anyways, the point being, the point's not really about clay pots. But what I'm trying to say is, to think about what a good pot is, we first have to think about what the pot is for. And so that's one of the things I want you to use as you're kind of tying together the different pieces of good argument as you understand it, respect together with ethos, etc., self-presentation ethos, by thinking about what argument is for. I like your use of Ratcliffe and your emphasis over and above Ratcliffe in some ways, that on the way that respect allows for further conversation. I think that's a really interesting and important point, and I'd like to see you see how you trace that out in your analyses of rhetorical artifacts in that major theoretical essay. And then when you're talking about evidence, again, you'll want to be connecting all these together. But when you're talking about evidence, you say, without evidence, anyone can give any reason for their beliefs or ideas while they argue. And while I'm certainly inclined to, I think probably obviously agree on the importance or value of evidence, I do want to challenge you a little here. So what? Why is that a problem? You say, without some way to prove, you have cold hard facts to back a certain side of the argument up. All that is being accomplished is the creation of a bad argument. Okay, that's fair enough. But that's just saying the same thing, right? That's not necessarily explaining yet. So what is evidence? Number one, what counts as evidence? How do we know when something is legitimate evidence? Why? And number two, who cares? Why does it matter if people just give any reason for their beliefs or ideas while they argue? What does evidence allow us to do relative to whatever it is that argument is for, as you understand it? Is it about changing a mind? Is it about influencing an attitude? Is it about arriving at a new understanding? What is argument for? Now, another thing I want to kind of encourage you to think about more is statistics. Statistics I also often find persuasive, and at the same time, as many social science scholars of my acquaintance and friendship will confirm, it's very easy to lie with statistics. In other words, statistics are, on the one hand, often, although not always, easy to check. Is this a true presentation of what the statistics are? But on the other hand, they're also very easy to frame misleadingly or badly or dishonestly. And so I want to encourage you to think about, how does the framing of statistics affect the value that they have for an argument? And what are good ways of framing and thinking about statistics? Anybody can just throw in some statistics that sort of suit their argument. But so what? Right? Yeah, you can check them, but how do you know that they're being framed honestly or correctly? What does it mean to frame them correctly? How do we know when they've been framed correctly? So I want to encourage you to think about statistics and in general sort of facts or evidence as both important in the way that you are, but also not sufficient in themselves, and to be thinking about, so what makes them sufficient? What makes them count as, properly speaking, evidence? And so this is really kind of pushing you to think more about what exactly evidence is, which I think is important because you're really lean on the idea of evidence as being the thing that creates good argument that has a solid foundation and that is meaningful for all of the parties involved. And so I think that's a good place to go to think about what exactly evidence means to you and why it matters. But I also want to kind of, like, as you're doing that, push yourself a little bit further. So ultimately, I hope what's clear is when I'm saying these things, I'm not really saying this is not a good statement of belief. This is a good statement of belief. But rather I'm saying these are the kinds of things, whether you wrote about these specific things or not, but these are the kinds of questions, the kinds of systematic questions that I want you to kind of have in mind and be working through as you're finishing up this final draft of the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay. I enjoyed reading this, and I look forward to reading that final draft. Thanks a lot.